All right, good morning to everyone here. My name is Brian Birch. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Ethics here at UVU, and it's my pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker for today's activities. So whether you're joining us in person or online, we want to let you know how welcome you are, and we invite you to be part of any of the sessions we're hosting throughout the week. So between now and Friday, we're hosting 13 different sessions, including panel discussions and lectures and film screenings and workshops and a variety of different kinds of activities. So if you're interested in knowing what else is going on this week, if you look on the sides of the room, you'll see QR codes, and you can just scan that code, and that'll take you directly to our webpage with our schedule. Also, if you're a student receiving credit for attendance here, there are also QR codes around the room for you to be able to scan in to receive attendance. So please make sure you do that so that your instructors know that you are here. So it's a real honor and treat to introduce our keynote speaker for me, because Gabriel Toscano is someone who I know well and have worked closely with here at UVU. He is a graduate at UVU, and he received 3 different bachelor's degrees, one in philosophy, one in integrated studies, where he combined Spanish and religious studies, and then a third in software development. And in addition to that, Gabe was a very important part of our staff in the Center for the Study of Ethics, where he was our communication specialist and helped us advance the work of our center and to be able to deliver our content across the web and in other media. So we're deeply grateful to Gabe, both professionally and for me personally, for what he has done for our center. And as you'll hear a little bit in his presentation today, you'll get a sense for how Gabe's experience at UVU connects with what he's doing now. He's a graduate student at Duke University in the Sanford School of Public Policy. He specializes in technology policy, and what's been fun for me to observe is how Gabe's different interests have been able to combine to the benefit of everyone he's around. So please join me in welcoming Gabriel Toscano.
Thank you all very much. It's my pleasure to be here today and joining you. Some friendly faces. UV is definitely my intellectual home, and I'm happy to be back. So as Brian mentioned, I worked on everything from religion studies to ethics and computer science. And now in the tech policy school, I'm doing all of them. So it's a really good time to talk about these issues. And when it comes to AI, although many of the machine learning techniques in question have been around for a very long time, commercially available AI seemed to come out of nowhere in 2022 with the release of generative AI software, particularly ChatGPT. But of course, now many competitors have followed suit. And I kind of imagine this is what the internet revolution felt like in the 80s and 90s. And like the internet, the AI is having heterogeneous effects and unevenly distributed effects. And as a policy person and technologist, I hope to serve as an interface between policymakers, technologists, and the broader society. And at the core of my talk today is a deep concern and commitment to advancing technologies in ways that advance the public interest. Unfortunately, I think we're largely failing at this task, and I hope to talk a little bit about why that might be, as well as some solutions, some ways of moving forward towards promoting the public interest. So different tech, same mistakes. I think this is a little bit of a looking back at history to understand our present and our future. I think we've made similar mistakes in the past with other kinds of technologies. And I'm going to use 2 examples of familiar technologies, process, food, and cars, to help us think about new technology. AI, I'm going to argue that despite being very different technologies in almost every way, their adoption and its impacts in society follow a very similar trajectory. It's a cycle we have seen before where technological transformations is framed as a fresh start of something very new, and we stop building on what's already working. And so we lose sight of the purpose of technology and the problems that technology was trying to solve, and we tend to overbuild and under and misregulate it. I'm also firmly against the idea that we either have to be techno-optimists or pessimists. I think takes away our agency and our ability to decide how technology is designed, used, and deployed. We need agency to correct course, and when we realize that the outcomes are not in the public interest, my talk is not about finding a perfect or ideal set of technologies or regulations. It's about how we can search for ways to advance shared goals and meet shared needs. It's about developing an alternative, and I would argue more desirable vision of how technology could work in the world. So if you're going to zoom out the rest of the time, this is a thing I would like ask you to look at. Um, so I think that what we're doing is asking people to orient themselves towards technology instead of asking how we can orient technology around people. Okay, this is kind of the summary of my argument, and hopefully that comes through throughout. So I think it's also important that we talk about how we could define AI. This is a really difficult thing to do. There's a lot of jargon out there, a lot of words, neural networks, machine learning, et cetera, et cetera. I think this is helpful in us having a conversation later on. So broadly, AI is any software that can perform tasks usually associated with human cognition. If you're interested in the history of the term, it dates back to the 1950s conference in Dartmouth. And machine learning, most of the AI we're talking about today is actually machine learning, a type of machine learning, and this is a statistical technique to find patterns from data. And increasingly, as data got more complex and bigger, we want to find bigger and more complex patterns. Machine learning lets us do that. And most of the AI systems that we interact with as the general public are also deep learning systems using neural networks. And this is a machine learning technique that uses neural networks, which is roughly a 1950s understanding of what neurons look like in the brain. And we take a lot of neurons and connect them in many layers. That's why they're deep. And the output of one set of neurons becomes the input of the next layer until we get a result, usually some kind of prediction. These get really big really fast. This is part of the reason why they're so hard to interpret. We don't really know why we're getting the output we're getting, and it's hard to repeat the same process reliably. And obviously, generative AI is the thing that most of us interact with. This is an application of these kind of systems in ways that do something useful for us in a way that we can interact. Why is this happening now? I think there's a combination of factors. Main one being new algorithms, but also computing power is increasing exponentially with more data centers being built all over the country and around the world. Some of the hyperscale data centers today are using as much power and water as entire towns. We also have massive data sets. Data sets used to train AI systems ballooned in size from compilations of hundreds of data points in the 1980s to over 1 trillion in the 2020s. We also got new algorithms. This was kind of the big breakthrough that people like Geoffrey Hinton brought forth. Things like backpropagation and transformers. Transformers are the T in ChatGPT. And they process things in parallel in ways that we weren't able to do before. And also because of capital investment. Globally, corporate AI investments reached about 250 billion in 2024. Just in the US, private AI investment is going to be was over 100 billion in 2024. Lastly, but certainly not least, is a regulatory environment that prioritizes innovation, often in ways that allow for very risky and technical business practices. And I just want to show you a bit of the scale of how big these tech companies are getting. Then people are making tons and tons of money doing this. On the left, so we have a list of the top biggest companies in the world right now. The top 6 are all tech companies. NVIDIA at the very top is the company that makes the chips that power a lot of these AI systems. And if we compare it to national economies, so GDP is a measure of how much an economy produces in a year, NVIDIA makes more money than most countries. Only 3 countries have bigger economies than NVIDIA's size, right? So an overwhelming amount of power. Only the top 6 countries are higher than Microsoft and Apple. And so these companies hold an immense influence over our lives, not only because they make technologies that we use and depend on every day, but because their economic and political power is massive. And what we decide to build and how we choose to regulate or not regulate them is going to matter quite a bit. Another pattern that I want to draw out is this idea of a digital gilded age. And this was introduced in a book by the ex-chairman of the SEC in a 2023 book. And he was in the middle of a lot of the transformations that we saw with the internet and digital age in the White House. And in his book, he compares the economic and regulatory environment that gave rise to the Gilded Age in the 19th century with the regulatory and economic situation of today. In the 1888 cartoon, The Bosses of the Senate, Joseph Kepler depicts the Senate as controlled by giant moneybags who represent the nation's financial trusts and monopolies in factories, railroads, and steel manufacturing. Fast forward to today, Tom Wheeler argues that the political and economic patterns of the Gilded Age are echoed today with the maturing of digital technologies. AI and the internet are largely the most ungoverned space, economic space, and in the past 20 to 30 years, tech companies are increasingly dominant and have come to such prominence very quickly, in large part because of the regulatory environment that promotes it. So shifting back to technology, I like to think about things in a way that kind of does away with some of the base assumptions of what we want technology to do and how we get there. And importantly, I think that people can shape the form and functionality of technologies, but can't decide effects and impact of its adoption. So people building technologies often fail to foresee and mitigate social risks and harm, mostly because that's not their job. That's not what they're trained to do, and we can't blame them for it. Builders will build, businesses make money, but it's the government's job to govern and make rules to keep people away from harm. So again, I'm going to look at 3 technologies to think about the gaps between intents and impacts in society, highly processed food, cars, and AI. And these technologies have this pattern of overbuilding, regulatory misalignment, and innovation that draws our attention away from finding solutions to our problems and instead of focusing on scaling these technologies. I will also give examples of how these technologies and the patterns demonstrate that when we notice the mistakes and start correcting course. So again, intent does not equal impact. And we're going to look at processed food first. So processed food has been around for a while, but not as long as many of us will think. In the US, at least, processed foods were developed to solve the problem of feeding troops abroad, particularly in the World War II period. Once the war ended, we shifted the manufacturing processes to feed people at home and obviously make things easier, cheaper, ideally promoting good nutritional value, but we know it's maybe not the case. But that was the general purpose of this technology. Moving on to today, according to the CDC, about 50% of calories in the US are from ultra-processed foods. And this is having an immense health effect that I would say is largely negative, particularly with non-communicable diseases. These are things that you don't pass from person to person, not like a virus or a bacteria or something. These are things that are dealing with habits and diets. And this disease burden is increasing exponentially also across pretty much every disease that we've been tracking. And if this graph went further down into the 20th century, we would see even a bigger spike. And in the US, we've had regulations about labels since the 1970s at least. And this label was the latest update from 2016, but it's still pretty difficult to interpret what it says for most of us, right? Most of us don't understand what daily value means in a real sense. And it's really hard to make good choices based on this. But other countries have started to realize this is probably a bad idea and are designing labels differently. Basically, labels that you don't have to know what it says. You don't even have to read it to really make a better choice or different choice than you would have done if this label was not as informative. So green means good, A means good, right? In Singapore, in Mexico, these labels are attached to anything on the front of the package that has excess of something that the government doesn't want people to consume as much. And this in Ecuador, it's also a very similar scenario where you have, lots of reds, that means bad, greens means good. And this is having really good outcomes for these countries. And I think the US is also falling behind this kind of technology and this kind of regulation, right? So this is the government's job to change how labels work. There are proposed rules right now in the US to change this, but it's kind of unlikely to happen in the next 4 years. I think a similar thing happened with cars. And let me just say this, that I like cars very much. I think they're great toys. But I think as a solution to move people quickly and efficiently and safely, trains and buses and your legs, and it's just a much better choice. Also, I love Formula One. If anyone wants to talk about that later, happy to talk about that. But in the 20th century, we started seeing mass commercialization of single operator, single owned cars, particularly the Ford Model T. And they were ostensibly selling beauty, comfort, convenience, utility. They were telling you to do away with the horse and carriage, which is probably a good idea. I think it would be really hard to have a ton of horses out in most parking lots today. And I think things started getting tricky when we started selling things like excitement instead of selling mobility. Um, and you can see that population, particularly at the very early stages when we were not regulating this stuff, were really, really high. And we started plateauing, particularly after things like seatbelts became legally mandated. But we're also seeing some spikes as of recent times, mostly because cars are getting bigger and heavier. And when you do crash or you hit someone or something, they're more likely to cause more harm. Again, I would say a regulatory misalignment. Cars, obviously, this is the story everybody knows. Lots of emissions. Almost a third of all emissions in the US are from transportation, and 83% of that portion of emissions comes from personal vehicles and commercial trucks. The US subsidizes gasoline, which promotes their production, et cetera. And we also have massive investment in road networks, which do away with investment in other kind of solutions. And just to give you a sense of the scale of how big roads are in the US, here's a comparison of the center of Florence. I think it's about 10,000 people live in this area, and then interchange in Atlanta. The cost of building these highways and repairing them is also increasing at about 24% per year. So it's a very, very costly thing to maintain. And they also leave a lot of cost to the user. You have to buy car insurance. You need parking on both ends of the trip. And we end up with things like this, right? And this is the stadium in LA, and you can see how much more space cars take up than people. And in the US today, there's about 8 parking spots per car, which is, I think, maybe not the best choice for the use of space. And people didn't want this when it started happening. It destroyed neighborhoods. It was also used as a way to promote racial segregation during the 60s and 70s. So they cut through about neighborhoods. And I think in Utah, it's very clear. Usually you have east-west divides that are very socioeconomically divided right along the freeway. And people were really wanting rapid transit and buses to remain and have funding. And just to give you a sense of why that might be is because we had a great transportation in the US prior to this being a thing. This is LA in the 1940s. And today, this is all like the electric rail cars that they had. The network was expansive. San Francisco had the largest rail network in the world at this time. We also had a similar thing here in Utah. And this is not a one-to-one comparison that we're seeing up here. The zooming in now, it's a little tricky, but we had a lot more routes, even than today, that we basically defunded and stopped managing. Provo also had railway car. I don't know if anybody knew this. I was really surprised to see this picture. But this is right downtown, right across the street from the temple. It had a railway car that went from downtown Provo all the way to Spanish Fork. And this was in the 1890s with far lower density population than today. So with the car issue, we started seeing, again, laws that did away with some of the more dangerous design practices, mandating seatbelts, emissions regulations, et cetera. And so we started seeing death rates decrease with, I mentioned the spike, the recent spike. And on some places, we stopped building highways and we actually removed them. This is a very infamous project called the Big Dig in Boston. Planning began in 1982 and construction took more than 10 years. The project was concluded in 2007 and they basically buried the highway in downtown Boston. Last but not least, we see that people are using transit more over time, especially when it's available. This is a graph of looking at buses on all the metro areas in the US. And I think these patterns will continue as bus routes become more frequent and easier to use. So finally, AI. And before I give AI the same treatment, let me warn you that there are a lot of negative consequences of the broad adoption of generative AI. And basically, we're building AI without seatbelts, and some actors are using AI to fill our information diets with junk. However, there are some good examples of using AI, particularly ones that are fine-tuned specific purposes, and I'll give you some of that as well, just to be fairness sake. So, what do we use AI for? To do code, to automate creation, to stop hiring people, perhaps to build your own AI girlfriend, to talk to patients as a helper for radiologists, to start a business, et cetera, et cetera. However, this is not having the scale and impact that a lot of businesses are hoping for. These are two pretty recent articles, one from MIT, one from Harvard. And in the MIT report, they're looking at what's the return on investment from people applying this stuff pretty early on. And they're seeing that about 95% of projects are not kind of paying back what they were hoping for, not even kind of cutting even. And the second one, this is also very recent work from the Harvard Business School. They're talking about this idea of AI generation and work slop. And the study defines work slop as AI generated work content that masquerades as good work but lacks the substance to meaningfully advance a given task. Right. So this might be good enough to get you a grade, especially if you don't care about the class, but probably not good enough to do a good job with. People are also getting in a lot of legal trouble when they use AI in ways that are maybe not beneficial. So this is a really common one. And someone from the previous session talked about this lawsuit. It prevented this AI they used for hiring was preventing people from getting hired when they were over 40. And people are using it to automate cybercrime, right? Building code faster that can be used maliciously. And people are using it to create deepfakes for people non-consensually. And there are some early inklings of a law in the US to prevent this kind of thing, but maybe not for the others. Here's some of the work that I've been working on, and this is a paper that I read to build my research from, and this idea that criminals are some of the best adopters of early technology. They're always looking for the edge, and they're using AI to do a much better job, right? And particularly when it comes to communications, language barriers used to be a barrier to entry for a lot of operations. Now that's basically gone. People can write really high quality text or high quality enough to defraud people, and people are using it to automate their scamming operations at scale. Another example is in code writing, and this is ostensibly also something that people generally agree that AI is good for, but code quality seems to be decreasing over time, particularly in projects that have been ongoing where we can compare like the time where people were coding in the system before AI and after AI. There's a lot of reasons for this happening. Feel free to ask me afterward if there's something you're interested in. Also, people are taking more time. Even experts are taking about 20% more time to build code because it's a lot of bad code that needs fixing, particularly when you're concerned about high-risk areas like cybersecurity. You definitely want to make sure the code is as quality as possible. And there are a lot of reports talking about how AI code makes it harder to maintain code, and this is for, again, lots of reasons, which I won't get into now, but feel free to ask me afterward. There's also really interesting cases of this going wrong in other contexts. This is now the kind of the canon case of AI gone wrong. There's an algorithm called Compass that was used to talked about they used data from sentencing to recommend parole to judges, right? And they found that it was basically racially profiling people, and it was used ostensibly for over a year, and it was quickly taken down afterward. When it comes to learning, I think this is also pretty interesting for us in the room, especially being at a university. Frequent AI chatbots use is associated with lower grades, both in assignments and in exams. So people who are learning new code, you need a lot of repetition, a lot of practice doing this. If you're kind of taking shortcuts, it's having negative consequences. And just to give you a sense of why I think this is also really important, this is a graph that came out again also like maybe a month ago from OpenAI talking about usage. So higher bars means more usage, lower bars means lower usage. Right about the time where school stopped, we see that this like cliff, right? So a lot of people are using this to do their work at school. There's also ethical issues that are kind of like second order here. People are talking about like agent stuff. So basically AI systems that can do things for you in the real world, whether it's send an email, whether it's send a report, whatever. And they're finding that people are more willing to do things that they find unethical they wouldn't do themselves, but they're willing to ask an AI to do it for them. They find it less troublesome to ask an AI to do it. This idea is here about this research here is about your brain on ChatGPT, and researchers at MIT were looking at how the brain lit up or didn't, different patterns of brain activity when you were using AI writing assignment tools. And they basically found that you were using less of your brain. Most of us could have probably guessed that, but now they have evidence. People couldn't even quote their own writing afterward, which is really problematic if you're doing a lot of work, if you're taking exams, etc. And similar to the car situation, people are realizing this is a bad idea. And this has to do with data centers and infrastructure surrounding AI and its use. electric bills are going up all around the country, not because there's less electricity, but just because demand is much higher now. And people are not happy with having data centers around them. So solutions. This is the start of the conversation that I think a lot of us want to have now. And this headline came from a project that somebody at Duke participated in. Her name is Cynthia Rudin. She runs a lab called the Interpretable Machine Learning Lab. So she's the anti-black box person. And she basically says, we have a lot of tools. A lot of them don't have to be black boxes. We should give people access to explanations about why we're getting the results we're getting. And as scientists, we need to do a better about providing those tools. There's also some policy emerging here, particularly with the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. What they did is talked about risks dealing with AI and talked about things that are just not permitted, things that are highly risk, mid-risk, low risk, and regulated them accordingly. There's also growing calls from the international community to have international laws that basically put red lines that AI can't cross. There are situations where AI should just never be used. Okay, so moving towards public interest AI, I think it's interesting to talk about what the public interest might be, first of all. And I think it encompasses three big things, basically, three pillars. So first, it's universal individual values. Universal values are things like promoting basic rights. You can think about universal human rights and things like that. Also contextualize individual values, things that are geographically bound, right? Issues concerning your community, your state, your country, etc. Individual preferences, things that you might want or not want. Ethical, social, and cultural norms, specific policies, candidates, political positions, the kind of things that you might vote for. There's also the pluralistic and ambiguous side of public interest, right? It's really hard to say like who the public is. What do you mean? What happens when we disagree? So the public interest, in my view, is very contextual and flexible. It encompasses competing needs and interests, and it's supposed to be about engaging different values, needs, and points of view toward shared goals. And lastly, I think the public interest is an approach rather than a destination. It's meant to be consensual, it's deliberative and process driven, but it's something that can never be fully complete, right? It's like kind of like saying like we're never going to finish democracy, right? Democracy is never finished. It's a process that we're going to be engaging in. And again, just if you zoomed out to this point, this is the slide to pay attention to. I think the public interest is about preventing harm at least. And at best, it's about equally sharing harms and the benefits, right? And I think this is what regulation is supposed to be kind of trying to achieve. And in terms of this Gilded Age, the economic pressures question, I think that the public interest should at any time serve as a counterbalance to the power of dominant interest groups in society. And when it comes to technology, I use this paper to think a lot about this issue. And they basically said no team of developers, no matter how they're constructed, no matter how ethically driven, is able to determine what is in the public interest. This is a very difficult job to do and requires public participation. It's also not what technologists are trained to do or want to do. Their job is to build features, not provide for the public interest. So what does the public want about AI? I'm going to show you some graphs from a really recent Pew survey where they asked AI experts what they think about AI and its social impacts and what they asked the public. And I want you to pay attention to how big the gaps are between those two groups. So basically what you should get from this is that the public is less likely than AI experts to say that AI will have a positive effect on the US over the next 20 years, and the gap is absolutely massive in my view. So the majority of respondents here said that either they don't know or it's going to be equal, or that it's not going to be a negative, as opposed to only 15% of AI experts. Here we see people being asked whether they think it's going to be very beneficial or how beneficial. Most people are saying that the risks are really high, where the benefits are lower than compared to the risks. So a majority of people in the US rate the risk as a society really high, and fewer rate the benefits of AI as high. Along the same lines, about half of the people that they surveyed are more concerned than excited about the increased use of AI in daily life. And again, if you're interested in this is all public. You can look for this online. And most people say that they really feel out of control when it comes to how AI is interacting with them, interacting in their lives. So I think this is particularly important when we talk about the public interest and what people want and the participatory process by which people get what they want. And concerning regulation, I think that most people are saying that we won't get this right. We won't get AI regulation right. This is basically what this is saying. We don't think the government will regulate AI appropriately. And so in thinking about moving forward from this, I looked at this paper called Antisocial Innovation. This is from a lawyer at Duke, and he's worked with economics thinking about how to build AI and how to build technology in general that is in the social benefit. And so we have two axes here. One, and the vertical axis is driving private value, so higher is more private value, and a horizontal axis where we see higher value on my right side, right? So what he says we want to do is be on this side of the equation, right? Right. We want higher social value things. And unfortunately, what I'm saying is that we're building a lot of things that are in the first and second boxes, not enough things that are in the fourth box. And his argument is that basically anything that is in that first box, these are the things that are very privately valuable, but maybe not socially valuable, we need to regulate them. And the things that might be negative privately, right, not economically feasible, not profitable, etc., but possibly social, we should be incentivizing them. So my argument is that we're building, again, a lot of things that are in the first box and not enough things in the fourth box. So solutions. So the first two are regulatory, and the third is a more technical solution that could involve regulation, but it's more about technical approaches to this. So first, I think we need to recalibrate and apply existing laws. So the first way we could do that is think about it in terms of same service, same rules. So before the internet era, communications were highly regulated, particularly things like telephone, and a telegraph. Just to give you a sense, if any one vendor had more than 39% of the market, they were considered a monopoly and they were broken up. Right, and this happened already in the 80s with AT&T, and it kind of spawned like a new era of communications in the US with more competition. And I think we need to do something similar with AI and the internet. We also need to expand the data privacy to the federal level. The US is one of the few democracies in the world that doesn't have a privacy and data law. I think that it's also difficult for companies to do a good job because they have to deal with like 50 states having different laws. It's really difficult to do this well. And so I think we need more coherent privacy practices. And certainly not last but not least is antitrust. This was something that was happening during the previous administration. It is not happening as much in this administration. It's unlikely to change, but we need to break up big tech, right? It's very unlikely that we're going to be able to conduct business in a way that promotes the public interest when these companies have very low risk and a lot of incentives to make as much money as possible, even when it puts people at risk. And we have those laws in place to make this happen. We just need to apply them. So we also need new policies that fulfill public interest needs, learning from our past successes. So first, we need to build and fund digital services as public infrastructure, right? Just like we fund roads, just like we fund the FDA, we need something like that for AI and digital infrastructure. Some people are calling for something like a digital FDA that tests for safety, but they also collect and investigate incidents, right? When things go wrong, someone that has expertise needs to be able to go out and look at these examples, see what to do about them. If you get sick, if you get hurt, somebody from the FDA will go to the restaurant where you get sick and ask them how this happened, right? Other places like China are also introducing things like algorithmic registries. I don't foresee something like that being viable in the US, but there are policy options that range and work within some of the similar mechanisms that we've built in the past to deal with other kinds of technologies. As I mentioned before, I think AI needs its seatbelt moment. When this happened in the 1950s and 60s, both people and the car makers did not like this, right? But today, obviously, we see the benefits, and I think most of us would largely agree that it's a good idea that we have seatbelts on things that are moving 100 miles an hour. But now car manufacturers compete on safety ratings, right? So the tide has shifted. There are also people introducing algorithmic laws at the state level. I think there are three interesting ones that I want to talk about. First is addictive feed laws. So these algorithms that keep you engaged for long periods of time, they're making rules about what you can optimize for, right? So you can't optimize for like virality or engagement or enragement, right? You can optimize for clickbait. and this is happening in California and New York. The other one is design code laws, which is a little more ambiguous, but I think very, very impactful. This is in Nebraska and Vermont, where they're asking companies to increase friction to ensure intentional usage. So right now, a lot of designs make you want to click on things and you don't even know why you clicked on it to begin with. They're asking to make it harder for you to do that and kind of nudge you in a different direction. And also, they're asking them to increase the privacy of their apps. There's also account limit laws and usage limit laws. One is from Mississippi, the other one is not from a state, it's from Australia. But the idea is that, how many times can someone request to be your friend? Maybe that shouldn't be up to them. It should be up to you, or they should be able to say it like maybe once, right? You can't just spam my account and I don't want to see your face. Leave me alone. I think there should be laws about this. And in Australia, they're actually not limiting children. This is also important in the US, not limiting children from using social media, but they're delaying until they're 16. So it's almost like getting your driver's license. You need to be 16 to have an account on social media. And this involves a level of having to check. This is a difficult policy problem. We'll see how this pans out, but there is some work happening there. And then in the technical side, I think that this is something that if you're in a computer science program, I hope you're listening, or if you're a tech entrepreneur, I hope you're listening. I think we need to incentivize the right tool for the right purpose. We need right-sized machine learning models and not super scale LLMs with godlike features. We also don't need an AI model for every 6 months, just like we probably don't need a new iPhone every year. And I think that we need to maintain and improve the best models and squeeze as much juice out of them. And this is also for efficiency's sake, right? I think these things take a long time. They're complex objects. We need to give engineers time to just really do a good job and test them for safety. We need to also give the government enough time to regulate these effectively. And also, I would argue that the best models that I've seen, and this is what I'm going to go through next, do something really well, and they focus on that one function instead of trying to do everything for you, right? So this is kind of the machine learning aspect more than the generative AI aspect. But even if you're using generative AI, I think that it's really difficult to build a system that performs well across all metrics and all the uses, and you get into a lot of trouble, and it's really difficult to test. I think that we should leave LLMs for explanatory, inconsequential, fun, generative things, right? I love to build like little cartoons and things with my generative AI. I think it's great as like an editor sometimes, but I don't think that we should shift our entire way of being, our entire way of learning around these new machines. So just to give you a sense for what I think we should do with AI, this is an example of a system called AlphaFold. And it's kind of old at this point, but I think it's one of the better examples that I could find. And it's one of the examples of something working really well for its intended purpose. So all they did was look at how proteins fold, which is a really difficult math problem. It was revolutionary when it happened. I would say it still is. We are reaping the benefits of this. And to give you a sense of how successful this was compared to humans, I think it took us, over 100 years to get like 100 of these proteins figured out, maybe low thousands. This found out 200 million of them, all right, in over a year. So people's PhDs, if you were in biochem, used to be about finding one of these shapes or building towards finding one of these shapes of one of these proteins. Now your PhD is about how to apply the shapes or which ones are more viable, which ones are important for whatever purpose you're looking for. The other one is online deliberation platform, and this speaks very directly to this question about how do we create systems that promote the public interest and how do we keep people engaged in the public process. There's this wording that I'm going to borrow from people in Taiwan that have really thought about how to revolutionize government around the tech revolution. And they basically say that government is running on 80-year-old or 200-year-old operating systems, right? And the rest of the world is moved way past that. So one of the things they're trying to do is build feedback loops between the public and policymakers so that we can find out when we're getting it wrong, right? When regulation isn't meeting the mark, we can have an easier route to know that, not just elections, right? You can think about elections as one of the feedback loops, but I think it seems insufficient. So what this platform does, it uses LLMs to take the place of a moderator in a debate or a discussion. And so what people have been doing with this is they'll get a representative sample of the population to go into a chat room and think about issues they care about, and the LLM is trained and specifically prompted to guide people towards conversations about points of agreement rather than disagreement, right? So they've done this in the US, and in the US, some of the things that come out is like people generally agree that we need to tax the rich, right? But that's usually never in our political kind of positions. Nobody's really running on that platform right now. People also think that um, we need to decrease cost of living, right? This is one of the things that people agree on generally. I think these kind of platforms can let us draw out some of the information and kind of find low-hanging fruit for policymaking earlier, sooner, at a higher quality, and engage more people in the political process in ways that are really expensive to do otherwise, right? So sending people all around the country to talk to people on the ground, find the samples. It's a really expensive, really labor-intensive process. I think this is a good way to use these platforms. And lastly, I think there's a lot to say about imagination. So this is an AI system that kind of like interposes a new image, a new vision of what this world could look like. So thinking about design, thinking about how do we build a better world that's more fun, that's more sustainable, that's nicer to live in. I think that this is a really interesting example of good uses of AI. So I'm proposing a set of tools that we can use to see how well we're doing when it comes to promoting the public interest with AI. So first is how much of this AI existing in the world is about a public justification and is not just profit oriented. And this has to do with questions of like which AI is the best tool for the problem, or are there non-AI tools to solve this problem? And if we're using an AI, which kind of AI is appropriate? And also understanding and arriving at the assumption that sometimes we might not need it at all. So many functions in society don't require AI or automation or new technology. Maybe we need to repair or maintain things that are already working. The second metric is how do they impact people, and thinking about in terms of equality. So how does this AI system shift power dynamics? And I think that we should move away from reducing responsible AI and AI for good as having systems that lack bias or a system that treats everyone equally. Right, we can treat people equally bad, right? So there's not really a good sense for doing that. I think we should think about power dynamics and what the purpose of the technology is to begin with and the problem they're trying to solve. The third, and I think this is a really difficult one and is still emerging, is following good technical standards, using the right tool for the right problem at hand, and stop using black boxes when you don't have to. This is a really new thing. This is a hard thing to do. I think it will take us a long time to get this right. I think the standards are still really quickly developing, but we're getting there. It's going to take time. I think easily 20 to 30 years to get standards that are workable across industries. And last is openness validation. And this draws from some of the work that I've done in open source software and open source AI. And open source software has been there for a really long time. And this is at the core of the technological revolution that gave way to the internet. A lot of the things that we depend on every day, the software running it is free and open source software. I think we need to do something similar with AI. And free and open source software is about freedom. Not it's free, not in the sense of like monetarily free, but it's about freedom for people to use, share, modify, and importantly, study the systems. It promotes public participation and continuous validation between stakeholders, inclusive of private and public interests, right? So it doesn't mean that companies can make money off their systems. It just means that we get to participate in the process. It means that government can use them to test them. It means that we have other tools, other alternatives to only privately owned AIs. Okay, so I think that AI is also full of false dilemmas. I hope most of you recognize the kind of trolley problem as a classic problem that we talk about. What do you do in a situation? And here we have two popular philosophers, Bentham, who says, he's a utilitarian. He says we should optimize for harm or benefit. He says the car must serve to save the most lives. And then we have the Kantian approach, which is more principle-based. He says, no, the car should never kill under any circumstances. And this is kind of a false dilemma, right? Because here we have the layperson saying, what if we just stopped and not kill everyone? And I think that the time we're in right now, I think a lot of people are filling our heads with false dilemmas about having to use AI or falling behind. I think there are very good reasons to believe that this is not the case. And I think that also the important part that I want to leave you with is that in thinking about public interest in AI, it's not it's less about having or not having access to AI, but about how AI is designed, deployed, and governed. It's about preventing AI that can be used to cause harm as much as it is about incentivizing humans not to use AI in ways that are harmful. So there's not a technical solution here. There's not a policy solution here. We need to shift all these things together towards the public interest. So the choice, of course, is not between having or not having AI, but rather how much AI and for what. In our world, given our capacities and limitations, as well as those of AI systems, I think that the benefits of putting AI into everything are outweighing its cost. Thank you very much. If you're interested in anything that I just talked about, again, feel free to talk to me. We'll have some time for Q&A here. But these are some of the books that I've been talking about and thinking about a lot recently. Again, feel free to ask me about any of this. My website's here. Feel free to grab my email if you're working on stuff like this or want to work on stuff like this. I would love to talk to you about this. Thank you very much.
So yes. You were talking about like regulations on AI for youth, and it made me think about the case with Mark Zuckerberg where he got in trouble for making social media too addictive. And I've always thought like I wouldn't say I was like super like in touch with that case, but in my mind I was like it should be the parents' fault for having their kids on social media. And I think that's the same thing with AI. As I think that parents or like their guardians or whoever's using it should govern their child on who can use it and stuff. And so I just wanted to like know a little bit more on like if like it like I don't know, like if I wanted to go smoke a cigarette, I know it's gonna hurt me, but I'm able to go do it. So if I want to go use AI or be on social media, like I know it's gonna hurt me, but I still should be allowed to do it. How come the government should govern that?
So I think that the question you ask is a very common one. So when should the government get involved, right? And I think the government, in most cases, at least in the system that we have in the U.S., should get involved when there's systemic harm. So when people are making the same mistake over and over again, right? When people are crashing their cars and dying over and over again, it's probably because this thing is dangerous enough where people's limitations don't allow them to stop that from happening. So I think the power dynamics are there because the power dynamics there are important because who's benefiting from not having safety features? Yeah, exactly. No one's benefiting and people are getting hurt. So that's what I would argue. So if they don't want it to do it voluntarily, if they don't want to stop creating addictive algorithms, I would argue that only Facebook is benefiting from algorithmic kind of addiction and most of us are getting harmed. I think that's when the government needs to get involved. It's when there's enough harm, enough of the time.
So you talked about AI black boxes, and I just wanted to hear a little bit more about like what are examples of AI black boxes, or how could they be made more open and available for people to understand?
Yeah, this is a bit out of my expertise. So I would highly encourage you to look at Cynthia Rudin's work. Cynthia Rudin, Rudin, and she runs a lab that all they do is think about how to tell which problems you can use with black boxes and which ones you can't, and developing the algorithmic techniques to actually go through with this. But I think the Compass algorithm is a really good one. So it took data about your demographics, right, your age, where you lived, what the offense was, if you've been to prison before, et cetera, and it made a decision about whether you should get parole or not, right? And so it's a risk assessment, very similar to like a credit risk assessment. We do this for all sorts of things, but importantly, it didn't tell the judge that was actually ultimately making the decision why it gave them the output they gave them, right? And when you have really high impact, high risk decisions like sending someone to jail, right? We should probably know um, why you're being tried in that way, why that risk assessment is that way. And I think that one of the applications that she uses, and this is the paper that I put up there, the why use black boxes when you don't have to. She went with a group of students to a competition where they were asking them to do credit rating using deep learning models that were really hard to interpret. And she was saying we don't have to, and so she used an alternative. They lost the competition, but she gained a lot of fans from that because her model was basically just as accurate as the black box model. But they could tell you exactly why this person didn't get the loan or the risk was really high. And in the U.S., one of the few things that we do regulate is things like credit, right? You cannot be denied a loan because you're too young, right, or too old, right? You have to be told a reason why. So actually, her algorithm demonstrated that, when regulation and the techniques to like implement these things work together, we get pretty good outcomes. But the impetus has to be there to develop those techniques. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, one more point about this. I consulted with a group that was building only explainable AI, right? And they used a lot of machine learning, K-nearest neighbor stuff, which again, if you're interested, ask me about that. But they were trying to sell this to a lot of manufacturers and to predict when people get hurt, right? When people would get hurt in like their factories. And a lot of them told them no. Because actually, once I know that I could have prevented this, now I'm legally liable. So there is a really tricky set of dynamics at play.
With you talking about how like the development of AI and where it is right now, it's a lot more about private interest than social interest. That's something I think about a lot, and how companies just have made AI and have included it in whatever company they may have to boost themselves. I often think about, and I don't know what like we can do as the people who are negatively impacted by AI. Like, what can we do to make AI more boosted towards the social interest without having to rely on our government?
Oof, that's a hard question. I think that I don't think there's a technical solution or a policy solution or just a social solution to all this. I think we need to try all of it all at once. I think that from just the lay public, what you can do is be informed about some of the ways that these things don't work well, and don't use them in those ways, and talk to your family and friends about them. I think that as much as I think that I'm much more of the idea that we should orient tech towards people instead of the other way around. Digital literacy is part of this, understanding the limitations and benefits of using this tech. Also being more vocal about this when you vote. Right. Ideally, some of us here are going to make decisions either at the local level with, what your job, or run for office. I think understanding these issues more deeply and understanding what the solutions might be are also really helpful ways to think about this. I would say don't crutch yourself by only knowing how to do things with AI. I think it's really important that we learn the right purposes for these things.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. I just want to say I loved what you added at the very end when you're talking about, maybe to ask you, because you talked about how we need to move from the first quadrant, which was, I want to say high private, negative social, and then you talked about how we should move more into this negative private, high social. I might have missed the first part when you started about talking about it, but could you talk more about that and how you can regulate this high social, the positive social, negative private thing? And like,
yeah. So I think that the idea there was that we need to incentivize these things. There are things that are not going to be very good market products. The best example of this are things that in like economics is this idea of like public goods, right? So there are things that to make them the first time it's really difficult and maybe really expensive, but every other thing that you make it's really cheap. So vaccines are a really good example of this, even though it's not a perfect public good if you're an economist out there. But it's really expensive to develop a vaccine, and then people want to get them for really cheap, right? And we generally want to have as many people take vaccines as possible, most people do. It's really expensive for the company that builds it, but really beneficial socially. So what we've done in the past is just have governments fund them and create these massive funds to get vaccines out there to as many people as possible, cheaply as possible. That probably wouldn't have happened at the same scale, at the same rate, if there wasn't public incentive, meaning government incentive to do that. So the fourth box is about how do we incentivize things that may not be profitable but are socially beneficial. In the AI space, that looks like small machine learning models that do tiny little things really well. So let me give you an example, again, because I talked about cars and I care about that stuff. Traffic, right? It's a huge problem everywhere. Almost every metro area has like horrible traffic, 5 p.m. every day, 9 a.m. every day, UVU parking lot, right? So like doing predictive algorithms to figure out in which ways can we actually like stagger things in different ways. But it's not about these massive machines that can do a lot of things. It's like, just tell me about traffic, figure that out, incentivizing those things that might not make a lot of money, right? And we probably don't want to make those things too expensive because we want people to use them and have broad access to them.
Thank you.
So yeah, small machine learning, small models. I think I'm a big advocate for that, and I think that the industry, I cross my fingers, will realize this with time. Building big models is too expensive. They're really risky. We're gonna get more juice out of that squeeze if we build smaller models that do one thing really well.
So hypothetically, all government regulation fails for AI, and it's like 50 years from now. What will be the things that are successful that are either not non-private regulation and non-governmental regulation? So like the kind of civic society engagement.
Okay. I know where this is coming from because we chatted yesterday, and I think that I'm not as cynical as you are. I think that it will take us a really long time. And just to give you a sense, and I meant to mention this in my presentation, it took us again 50 years or so to get seatbelts in cars to be a thing. This is a simpler machine. This is almost like right now it feels so obvious that we would. So I think about what's obvious for AI. So I don't think we're gonna fail. I think that people are doing things already that are working. But I do think the civic society piece has a big part to play, particularly in how these things are deployed and for what purposes, right? So being good use cases, right? Working with developers to say this is harming people in this way, this is not in this way. That scam GPT thing that I mentioned, that comes from a think tank, people who are looking at how are people using this in ways that the industry is not interested in investigating and the government is not investigating. Let's look at those gaps. Let's learn from each other. How do we can prevent this from happening? So I think a lot of it is going to be research and application. Yeah.
Thank you.
So one of the things that I loved this, by the way, thank you so much for bringing this up, because we talk about AI as this new technology, because it is. It's all of these things, but it's like 3 years old. We're talking like the other examples you used: cars, processed foods. I know the third one, but it left my brain just recently. But you have all these different examples. They took years and years to get to the point where they're like really, really harmful. Like the Model T was causing deaths, but it was not going 50 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour, 200 miles an hour down the freeway. AI is like deadliness is speeding up so much faster. So with the regulation, with all this other stuff, how is it that we're going to be able to try and keep up with that ramp up that we did not see with these other technologies you mentioned?
You're asking all the hard questions.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I really don't know. And I don't think anybody really knows what's going to happen. I think that, again, the reason why I talked about the internet too, I think that many of the things that we're seeing are the bad things we're seeing is because we also failed to regulate the internet. And people thought the internet was going to solve race. They thought that racism was not going to be a thing after the internet, right? And if you look on Facebook today, obviously not the case. And there's a really good book about that if you're interested by Ruha Benjamin. It's called Race After Technology. Highly recommend if you're interested in that. So, I don't really know. I think we have to try everything. Everything that you can do, you should give it a shot because it's early enough where something might take off. The problem that I see, and this is why I hark on the regulations part, is that even if you find really good solutions, even if you're within an industry and you find really good solutions, but you're threatening a business model that's already working that a big player has, they're going to buy you out. And they're going to do everything in your power to make sure you don't succeed because you succeeding might mean them not succeeding anymore, right? This is the classic problem The biggest threat to capitalists are, new capitalists, old capitalists, right? The biggest threat to new innovations are old innovators, right? And this is why I think that antitrust in particular will be helpful. I think that especially in education space, I really find it difficult to see how we can implement AI in ways that are helpful because students already are, right? People are using this. The graph was very clear. People are already using this. The institutions behind these things are having a really hard time catching up. I think that requires a domain expertise that I don't have. I think it's going to be very domain specific. Like, how do we catch up to the speed? It's going to depend on what context we're talking about, and we need experts more than ever.
So we kind of touched on like bias in AI, and I was just kind of wondering, do you feel like bias from AI comes more from like the choice of materials that are being used to train the model, or more choices made by people training the models in what sources they choose, and kind of like how we can prevent bias from playing a bigger role in AI since it's already a pretty big issue in society in general?
Yeah, I think both. So let me get to the last part, the bias in society in general. I think this is something that happens all the time, and I think it's a very dishonest move. Like, oh, but humans are biased. Yeah, but not systematically and not this scale, right? So scale changes the impact, right? So if one person is biased against old people, it's different than having this machine that like looks at 1,000 applications and is biased against old people. That's a very different kind of question, right? So to that point. To your earlier point, I think it's both. So first, it's what objectives, what are you optimizing for? What are you trying to do with the system to begin with? I think it's really important, and that's kind of like in the builder side of things. The data is kind of like your ceiling, right? And machine learning, and I think I find it really ironic of how much people are talking about the AI is bringing the future, because AI is only backward looking. That's all it can do, right? So and we're gonna probably replicate a lot of those patterns, whether we understand it or not. Um, if you don't have unbiased data, it's really difficult to get an unbiased machine. And this is another reason why I'm an advocate for small AIs, right? Small models, because when you have a smaller model, you can take more time and look at the data. It's data sets, not always, but it's more likely to be a data set that you can actually look at with more care and do a better job understanding what the biases might be and what you might be optimizing for when you train on this. Whereas if you have these massive data sets that nobody could ever really parse through, you're gonna get good things and bad things, right? It's kind of like what's the word that people use to talk about fishing when you use dragnet fishing, right? You're gonna get a lot of fish that you don't want in there, right? And you're gonna do a lot of damage in the way. Whereas if you're spear fishing, you're gonna get your target more of the time. So I think we need to do smaller things that we can do really well instead of trying to do the huge thing that we likely won't do well over time. I would love to be wrong about this, by the way. Like if that happened to be the case and somebody discovers a new algorithm that's like, nope, fine tune, there's a knob we can twist, some math we find. I just don't think that's the case. I don't think that's gonna happen.
Others?
Hey, you talked to us a little bit about the advent of the use of some of these AI tools in cybercrime.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you have some resources for us or have thoughts on the use of AI sort of as a front for white collar crime in different instances. So a good example of this would be a company using a AI classification algorithm to deny somebody healthcare or access to healthcare based on a protected characteristic, but they build an AI model that sort of makes the decision for them. So there's no one to specifically point at and say, oh, this was discrimination, or it's very hard to prove discrimination when we don't have good interpretability.
Absolutely. I think this is rampant. Actually, the people that are getting the most juice out of this economically are the people who are doing exactly this, right? The best example that I have of this is an algorithm called RealPage, and it was built to do algorithmic pricing of rental units all across the country. They're getting sued everywhere now. And so what they did was, according to the lawsuit, was price fixing, right? So the analog example of this happened in the 80s. Airlines got together and were like, let's just check each other's prices and increase everyone together so there wouldn't be a market competition, right? We would all increase at the same time. That's collusion, that's illegal, that's monopoly behavior. You can't do that. They got in a lot of trouble over doing this. However, if you do this algorithmically, we're all using the same algorithm and the same company, and we're all giving them our data, right? Which is the equivalent of them coming together and looking at each other's prices. And then they set the algorithm for you, and they are setting the prices, and they're obviously RailPage is making a profit of a percentage of every rental. So the higher the rent overall, the more money they make. The idea here, the lawsuit claims, is that they're doing collusion, but they're using an opaque system, right? And the idea that you can't look at an algorithm because it's my intellectual property to hide behind and to conduct illegal behavior, white collar crime in ways that have not been possible in the past. So yes, this is happening all over the place. Insurance companies are starting to get in a lot of trouble over this. One of the things that I think machine learning and talking about the bias question, it will find the best way to get to the lowest error rate, to make the best predictions, right? And sometimes it may be tracking for things that you don't realize it's tracking for. So in the Compass algorithm, it was tracking for race really closely because in the US, zip codes are a really good proxy for race. They didn't know that. There was not even a race column in the data set, but right, the social dynamics are such that, and the policing of people dynamics are such that that was really what the system, or part of what the system was optimizing for. I think we are doing that. And I think lawsuits are coming to tackle this kind of issue.
Thank you.
Okay, Gabe, thank you very much for your presentation. A lot of food for thought. Gabe's contact information is there on the slide. If you have any other questions for him, or feel free to contact the Ethics Center if you want to reach out. Once again, if you're students who are here for credit, there are QR codes all over the place on the backs of your chairs and on the walls for you to check in so that your instructors know that you are here.
Yeah,
So with that said, please join me in thanking Gabe Toscano.
Yeah, and if you're interested in just think about like public school or anything related to grad school, I'd love to chat with you about that. I love it. So love to help people get to a place where they want to be and work on this stuff. We need help.